Hello, my name is Joseph Wesley Cross. Today, I would like to talk to you about physics. You may very well know there are positives, negatives, neutrals, etc. existent in space, time, etc. Space and time. I wanted to talk about dark matter, but before I get into that, I want to prequel you a little bit more about the natures of positive and negatives, neutral, etc. What I'd like to describe to you, firstly, is that in original retrospect, dark matter was theoretically negative. This is not correct. There is negative atomic matter. There is positive atomic matter. There's neutral atomic matter. There's dark matter. And there is productive matter. Energetic, so they say. I don't have any dry erase, so let's see if I can use a sketchbook maybe. Firstly, you'll come to find that protons and neutrons, of course, not the same. Electrons are not negative either. And dark matter is not electron, generally speaking. For you to grasp that, you'll have to think of everything, firstly, along the scientific ranges of class and type. You'll see that there's species, etc., etc. Many words that relate to life rather than material, and not many that relate to material, which is why physics is such a difficult topic to explain. What you want to know is that most often neutrons are seen as protons, because most often you never find protons existing elsewhere than neutron. My first profession about that is that you'll have to recognize that protons aren't essentially just floating around, emanating their fields, which is a belief about neutrons, that neutrons are containing that positive energy, compressing it and storing it. Compressing. Think about that first. And then skip past it and let's keep going. The big deal is that protons are not particularly as large as most physicists or people will believe. Protons are actually smaller than electrons. And I know you're going to think that's absolutely bonkers, but it's the truth. You'll find that a neutron holding protons has actually opened or expanded the proton rather than compressing it. So that theory is absolutely incorrect. Essentially, the neutron is balancing all of the negative atomics. And I don't want to say electrons because I'm going to explain what electrons are rather later on. And I'm not going to say that it's harboring dark matter either, because that's not correct either, okay? And by the way, dark matter is not a single kind of atomic. It's more like a class. Protons are more like a class. Electrons are more like a class. When you're thinking about types, you're getting into the smaller representations like quarks. I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible. So the point is, like I said, the neutrons are actually harboring protons and megatrons, or negatrons, whichever you want to say. Because most poignantly, you'll find that a negative atomic nucleal entity, negatron, megatron, they're usually quite large in comparison to the other protons or electrons, etc. This is because it is not necessarily that the protons or the electrons have a specific proportion in comparison, because the negative atomic materials have a range of proportions. It is like in the essence of describing a star. You have a star. It has a lifetime, as they say, a duration. I'd rather not use the word lifetime. I'd rather call it a duration of its existence. The star is holding many negative atomic materials. If I were to use the word bubbles to describe each one, then you would get so distorted and distracted that it wouldn't make enough sense. So, much rather, that is why people use diagramming. So, the point is, the star, like I said, is holding a collection of, not to say cores, but much rather to say orbitals around its core, at the center of it. And this is just and purely, still only, spherical existence amongst space, as extreme as it is. And where we are in space, as far as we can see, we know that there are different shaped objects, different shaped stars. We tend to hint it, but hide it with things like quasar images and so on and so forth. You can still have prismal stars. They could be shaped like a diamond. However, more popularly amongst physicists, it's theorized that it's a star contained within a prism. Not always true. The prism surrounding it can essentially be the nutrition for the star itself. Anyway, the point is, like I was saying, the core of the star is holding many orbitals. Most often you'll come to find that the negatives are perpetual baiters. They will perpetually bait positives and essentially other things, etc., in order to grow, in order to become larger, to become more substantial amongst existence. With this occurring, you'll come to find that there becomes, in theory, more or less nothing but negatives in existence, without protons, positives, neutrals, dark matter, productive matter. To say the star is holding these orbitals is to say that relatively in the scheme of a solar system holding many planets, each of those orbitals in the star itself, inside of the burning ball, are poignantly the root of the planet's orbits around the star itself. They are the attraction factor. So to say, each planet may have one or more polarity points. The thing is, when you only have one, the planet is destined to be sucked into the star and be consumed by that orbital within the star. Now, the balance of the solar system is based off of the fact that those other magnetic natures and relations between the other planets and the star and the orbitals inside the star are the reason that there are orbital planes and the reason why planets perpetually maintain their orbit. So the theory goes here that the planet has as they say, north and south pole. To describe this, it would be to say the North Pole is attracted to the orbital within the star, whereas the South Pole is negative to that orbital within the star. So it's not necessarily negative, but you can't describe it with just positive and negative wording. So the truth is there's a range beyond that. There's a range beyond the words positive, negative, and neutral, elective, pixelative, pixely, whatever you want to say. I'm going to get into that word later, possibly on another video. I think I'll keep this video as a first production out. But the point being, during the orbit of that planet, you'll find that it's an ellipse process. When the planet ranges farther from the star or the core, and keep in mind as well that stars are also satellites in galaxies. Regardless of that also, the planet will be attracted to the orbital within the star at its most extended distance from that star. So the peak of the ellipse is the strength of the attraction factor of the magnetics. That, in essence, of also describing it in a field where during the experiment, if you put two magnets in a vacuum and they're close together in that vacuum, yet you spread them apart, you've essentially created a static field where you'll see sparking and electricity and energy. There's a fluctuation there, it's a flux. So basically, the balance of the ecosystem and the nature and the weather on planet Earth is reciprocal of the other planets during their extended or peaks of ellipse in orbits. Meaning it's predictable because those other planets have either ellipsed a little farther than their normalcy and caused a static which can cause something like a hurricane, a major storm, or maybe just a little bit, and it just causes an average storm. But if it's closer in comparison, the difference of the weather caused is more of a depression, as they say. Whereas depression, you would think that the atmosphere is compressing down, but much rather it's that the atmosphere is alofting, meaning the imbalance caused by the closer proximity of the ellipse caused the atmosphere to bubble or form outwardly to reciprocate that occurrence in the nature. And that is most often and always representable by saying that it is because of a planet which holds the same elemental balances as our own. So as to say, let's put it in layman's terms, we have, because we know more than that, we have nitrogen in our atmosphere, or we have hydrogen in our atmosphere because of the humidity and everything. In popular retrospect, people would say Uranus or Neptune hold hydrogen because of the blue, blah, blah, blah. Uranus or Neptune had and this is where it's the numerology system, Uranus or Neptune had the imbalance of orbital peaking, causing the depression or the aloftness of the atmosphere, the thinning. This occurrence is basically like an expansion of the atmospheric range in that pocket. It doesn't necessarily mean that the atmosphere lifted, because it's not particularly bubbling, it's formulating. So essentially it's expanding in a general range, meaning that it's at the same time it's expanding, it's sucking in other elements and atoms, etc. So there's a vacuum effect there. Not only does that happen, but it causes the collections, the bonds, the compounds, etc., that lead towards storms, lightning, thunder. When that occurs, it's essentially held, maintained, until it is reciprocal of a above average peak of orbital ellipse. Thus, the reaction of the duality of the reality here, the stored materials tend to burst with energy when the static forms, when the static occurs. This is the general ebb and flow of the materials in a solar system, which is most often why most solar systems are most prolongingly existent, or exist over longer durations when they're shelled by something. In our instance, shelled by ice. So the big thing about the orbital planes, etc., is that the star is holding the correspondent to the planets. The planets holding correspondence to the moons. Now, on a planet where you have earthquakes and mountains and volcanoes erupting and everything like that, it's very active. However, it is progressing through its duration faster than it could be, meaning it's burning out. Wherein you'll come to find this happens often, but not always. It is because there is an orbital within the planet around that core which needs to be reciprocated by a moon, another satellite of specific material. This usually balances out. A moon will form in this scenario, in this range of occurrences from the ice shell. Now, in essence of describing the general ecosystem of the solar system or the galaxy itself, to start with the solar system, we have to understand the entire solar system is drifting around the galactic core, as well as the galaxy core is drifting through space, sometimes possibly around another core, which leads to universe theory, bubble theory. There's so many ways that it's described. But essentially, the solar system, adrift amongst space, is not only one, collecting many different elements, dusts and dirts and compounds, but it is also storing those compounds. Not only is it harboring planets, but on those planets, compounds are escaping the magnitude, the gravity of the planet itself. The reason there are collisions is essentially like a miscalculation. It is to say that this orbit coerced with this orbit, coerced with this orbit around the star, and at some point they collided with their orbits. Sometimes this happens. This has to do with the number of orbitals inside the star around its core, and you get it, the entire correspondence in general. The ecosystem of the solar system is that gases, dirts, etc. escape during these depressions and compressions and storms. So storm is more like a compression rather than a depression, because, like I said, the static caused by the peak of the ellipse has a natural balancing reaction in the atmosphere, and this occurs on all of the planets. So this is exactly how we explain the storm on Jupiter. Now, the biggest point about the storm on Jupiter is that you have to recognize it's a gas giant. The biggest point about Mercury is that you have to recognize it's essentially being singed perpetually, or being cooked because of its proximity. It is rather that Mercury is the correspondent to the actual core. Yet, so are the other orbitals inside the star. So explaining the storm on Jupiter is very similar. You see, Mercury may be sucked into the star and become part of the core. However, there may be many other planets inside the star, which are like Mercury, which in that event are given the opportunity to be expelled from the star and be categorized as planets again, changed, imbued with different natures, mutated, as they say, evolved maybe. The biggest point is it's just the star's diet. See, physics is beautiful that way. It's a little bit about me there. Beyond all of that, you can also come to find that not only are stars harboring all of these orbitals inside of them, inside of their burning gases, but you're going to have to recognize that in comparison, Jupiter may be holding many orbitals within its general meniscus of atmosphere and gas giant essence. Meaning, why is it black inside? You would typically think of it as a core, but it's another orbital around the core of Jupiter. The general magnitude of its relations causes the gases around it to swirl, swish, storm. Essentially, in my theoretical expression, this is because it is like a South Pole reciprocal to one of the moons of Jupiter. Clear as day. But it seems that it wasn't found that way. 3 moons. 3 moons. 3 moons. Those 3 moons around Jupiter, corresponding to that repulsive bundle of material, the eye of the storm. When passing over the storm, will ellipse farther. Now, this is because when the moon or the planet around the planet or the star reaches its close proximity point, it's at its rejective state. However, that attraction factor at the peak of its ellipse, as it travels away, is the reason that it's held so closely to the other side of the star, though, during its time in that process, in that scenario. So essentially, the planet is being repelled by the star. Yet, if it were on the other side of the star, during that same proximity, it would be sucked into the star and would not be a planet any longer. It would be an orbital around the core within the star. Now, the reason that stars are so sufficient at maintaining their burn is because their core holds a field like black holes do. Similarly, it may seem like the material is dense enough to be liquid. But the field is so strong that that core is actually attracting so intensely the material that it's compressing it, even though it's still a gas, into a liquid format of density, a liquid density. However, it's still not a liquid. The beauty of describing this with H2O is that H2O in a gaseous state is barely a compound. Barely a compound. It's so active that quite often it will evaporate instead, or so on and so forth. So the big thing is, you may have a water that's not really clear per se, if you were to test it with the angles of light and reflections and so on and so forth. But saturated with hydrogen. It's very common for H2O molecules to harbor hydrogen molecules for the future, because the hydrogen molecule is essentially the nutrition for the oxygen. In that instance, where does hydrogen become produced, they say? It's a very good question. But we're on a bigger topic. No, the hydrogen forms through processions of other food chain occurrences, like rainforest plants essentially produce it would be like saying some rainforest plants, some of the taller ones maybe, as they would say, there's a whole range, I promise, produce hydrogen through their respiratory because they don't really consume it when it rains. What the plant is really consuming is the energy caused by the reaction of hydrogen and oxygen and other materials being processed within it, which is exactly what all life forms do with their diets. So to speak, it's very rare that you will truly need, the material itself. The things that you're actually consuming and using are the energy and the bonds, etc. This is disgusting, but when you poop, you would essentially compress the material together as well as waste. So it's kind of like you see a little atomic structure inside of a turd. But that's essentially what's going on. It's not really a compound. It's just a bunch of like atoms squished together around waste. waste, organic waste. And that's to say that that's all like dead cells and dead material that your body is cycling out from the inside. Because you know that your skin, anyway. The big thing about the ecosystem of the solar system, I got way out there on biology. Sorry. Like I said, the weather is correspondent to the orbital ellipse peaks and so on. The close proximity of a planet to a star is because it's rejected by the opposite end of the spectrum bond of the orbital duet within the star around the core. Whereas when it's farther away, it's the attraction factor, which brings it back, and it's the orbit. As it's all adrift through space, the atmosphere is releasing material. The system itself is collecting material as it drifts through space and then releasing material into space. Essentially, to say what is occurring when people would say that Andromeda is on a collision course, it's because Andromeda is starting to feed off of the waste that the Milky Way is emitting. So Andromeda is starting to drift towards the Milky Way. So essentially the Milky Way, as it's projected, is still slightly unknown, is destined for a collision from Andromeda. Whereas really Andromeda is like what I would call a repo galaxy. It's a galaxy that drifts around collecting materials, kind of like black holes do, and I'm going to get to that later on another video. Collecting materials that are this close to springing into activity. Like to say that maybe it's going to collect a planet out of the galaxy that it's inching towards, so that a planet doesn't explode and the material isn't wasted, so to speak. So Andromeda is going to be like the big icebox that snags up that planet, chills it and compresses it, and maintains it and keeps it from spoiling, so to speak. Because when nothing is done about, or nothing is destined for that planet, it's going to react as its normal nature and just, or start emitting quasars or causing dangerous environments, etc. It's not good. And beyond that, now you understand the solar system. The galaxy sort of works the same way. I'm going to get a little bit more into that on the next video. I hope you enjoy it. Probably nobody will watch this video because it's 40 minutes long. I have 0 followers. It's a brand new account. And nobody really knows me that well. And nobody really knows about this account. But the big thing is, at least I got to put it out there. I got to speak about it. I had the opportunity, and I used it. So the big picture is, thank you for watching. Now you understand a little bit about positive and negative, and so on and so forth. I feel like, I hope I've kept you captivated and reciprocal of the message, rather than feeling like you're attention deficited towards other things or whatever, what have you. thank you again, and here shortly I'll produce another video as I'm going to basically back-to-back record, and it'll be about black holes and dark matter and so on and so forth, and I will explain it. All right, thank you. Check back later. Have a good one.